Welcome to Faith and Rationality Shop Talk. This is fun conversations about fascinating research, and today is episode 1. And I'm glad to have as my first guest Joe Schmid, who is an amazing philosopher in his own right. And today we're going to discuss his paper, Classical Theism, Arbitrary Creation, and Reason-Based Action. And that was published in Sophia, and I'll provide a link to it down below as well, so you can check it out. It's a response to R.T. Mullins' paper, The Problem of Arbitrary Creation for Impassibility, and that was published in the journal Open Theology. I'll provide a link to that as well. Joe has a wonderful philosophy channel, philosophy of religion, analytic metaphysics, called The Majesty of Reason. So, Joe, welcome to the show, and I'd love to hear just initially, what are your plans for the channel? Do you have any upcoming series or anything, your videos you're working on that we should look for?
Yeah, thank you for having me on. I'm excited for this conversation. I haven't talked about this paper on other channels, so yeah, I'm excited for this. About my channel, Majesty of Reason, I basically bring on different philosophers to have conversations with them. I make my own lecture videos. I do everything in between. I have some fun, put some bonus soccer in there at the end. So yeah, it's my channel. It's philosophy of religion, metaphysics, philosophy of time. So yeah, as for upcoming plans on the channel, this Friday I've got a video coming out, and I am so pumped about it. It is a user's guide to Bayes' theorem. And it is like I don't want to say comprehensive, but it's a close to comprehensive guide to Bayes' theorem. What is Bayes' theorem? How to use it? How not to use it? How to use it in philosophy, in statistics? What's the requisite background? What is probability? What are different interpretations of probability? What are the Kolmogorov axioms, and how do they relate to Bayes' theorem? How do we prove Bayes' theorem? How do we know that it's true? Everything. And I'm just very excited for this. I put so much effort into it. It is 3 hours and 22 minutes long. And
wow.
Yeah. And so I'm pumped. I'm hoping that's going to be a really good resource for people who are getting into philosophy and want to know how Bayes' theorem is used into it, because there's a high barrier to entry in these sorts of areas. You hear people talking about the expectation of data on certain hypotheses, and then they talk about the likelihood ratio or the Bayes factor, and then how that pertains to evidential confirmation. And to the uninitiated, this is just like, what are you guys talking about? You know, it's as if you are talking to an intro philosophy student or intro psychology student and talking to them about the R value and different correlations and, you know, things like that they've never heard of. So yeah, I'm hoping that this can be a guide to the uninitiated and also help people who are initiated as well. So yeah, I'm very excited for that. That's the main thing coming up. And then other than that, you know, people can check out my Kalam series with Stephen Woodford. They can check out, that's on his channel, Rationality Rules. They can check out, yeah, just my playlists and anything on my channel. So yeah.
Great. So definitely go subscribe. And Joe, that sounds amazing. I took a grad seminar on Bayes' theorem and probability, and it was, whew. I wish I had your video back then just as a crash course, because we were just thrown into the deep end. And as you know, and the audience may know, a lot of Richard Swinburne's work and a lot of other philosophers in the philosophy of religion rely on probability for their arguments. So that's a great service. If you're watching this and the video's already passed, then I'll provide a link to it also in the show notes.
Sounds good.
Awesome. And Joe has already published, this just blows my mind. Joe has already published 2 books, one self-published, awesome critical thinking and philosophy guide. I definitely recommend picking that up, The Majesty of Reason. And then he just published with Springer, Existential Inertia and Classical Theistic Proofs with Daniel Linford. Now, let me just go ahead and give you a question. I would love to hear, if you're going to be stranded on a desert island with no hope of getting off for 10 years, we could just say you're shipwrecked or something, what 5 books would you bring to the island?
Good question. So I'd probably bring, firstly, one of my favorite fiction books, which is Aldous Huxley's Brave New World. I just love it, the exploration of individuality and how that relates to state authority and subtle criticisms of utilitarianism and, you know, things like that. I just really like Brave New World, so I'd probably bring that as the fiction book. And then the other four would be philosophy books. So one of them would probably be The Atlas of Reality by Rob Coons and Tim Pickavants. It's just this monolithic book that's like 700 or 800 pages long, and it's like a comprehensive guide to metaphysics. So anyway, there's a lot in there that's can spur thinking. There's a lot in there. It's basically just a guide through metaphysics. So that's going to be a very, very helpful thing to me, and it'll keep me occupied, and there's just a lot in there. The next one is Theism and Atheism, Opposing Arguments in Philosophy. That is edited by Graham Oppie and I think Joseph Kopersky or something like that, or Kotersky, I forget his name. But yeah, it's this edited collection of different theistic and atheistic philosophers who do like one paper each, or one chapter each on a topic in philosophy of religion. It goes through the major topics like miracles, God's existence, cosmological arguments, fine-tuning arguments, like things like that. Really good volume. So I definitely bring that along. Another one that I bring along is, and this is the fourth, is J.H. Sobel's Logic and Theism. Just such a stellar book. Probably my favorite book on the non-theistic side. Other than my book, of course, no. But, J.H. Sobel, his Logic and Theism is a masterpiece, so I'd probably bring that. And then finally, perhaps the best book on the theistic side, Richard Swinburne's The Existence of God. So a balanced palette, but a very quality palette.
That is excellent. Those are awesome book suggestions as well. So, yeah, thank you for sharing that. And let's go ahead and jump in. So, I'd love for you, if you don't mind, to just explain to us just briefly the four doctrines that make classical theism unique, and then really what's at stake in this debate between classical theism on one hand and non-classical theism on the other hand. And sometimes it's called theistic personalism. If you could just go ahead and give us kind of a flavor for classical theism and then what's at stake in this debate.
Yeah, absolutely. So broadly speaking, we're talking about models of God here. A model of God is just a way of conceiving of God, God's nature, and God's relation to the world. So basically theories about God, theories about the way God is and the way that God relates to the world. So we're talking about different models of God. One model of God is classical theism, and then another model, or really family of models, they're both kind of families of models, to be honest, but the two broad families of models here are classical theism and non-classical theism, or classical theistic models of God and non-classical theistic models of God. Now, generally speaking, both classical and non-classical theistic models of God share a lot in common. They have certain core attributes that they ascribe to God. God is, in general, conceived of as the perfect, ultimate, independent foundation of reality. So God is ultimate. He explains why there are other things in the world, and he's not further explained. He's not dependent on something for his existence, and he's perfect. He is supreme in value. He is the axiological apex, as someone on the internet has put it. I think that's a funny way to put it. So anyway, that's a kind of core notion of God, this perfect foundational reality and personal foundational reality that created the universe, etc. Okay, so we got these core attributes, and they're going to go on to ascribe things like omniscience, omnipotence, perfect freedom, perfect rationality, providence, all these sorts of things that are shared in common among classical and non-classical theistic models of God. But classical theism makes four distinctive claims about God. Some might say they're radical, but they're four distinctive claims about God, in addition to that core. So they're obviously going to say God is omniscient, omnipotent, wholly good, perfect freedom, etc. But they're making four additional distinct claims about God. And those four are simplicity, timelessness, immutability, and impassibility. So the doctrine of divine simplicity basically just says that God doesn't have parts. So God's not composed of any parts, not physical parts, and also not metaphysical parts, like distinct attributes or distinct properties or distinct whatever. So a more formal way to put this is everything in God is identical to God, or everything intrinsic to God is identical to God. To say that something is intrinsic to another thing, or to predicate a property of something intrinsically, is basically to characterize that thing as it is in itself. So like, I am intrinsically human. My being human doesn't depend on how things outside of me are, or my relations to things add extra. No, it characterizes me as I am in myself. So what classical theists are saying when they say that God is simple is saying that everything intrinsic to God, everything that characterizes God as he is in himself, just is God himself. So this is why people will often say God is like being itself, or he's goodness itself, or he is his omniscience, he is his omnipotence, etc. So that's simplicity. Everything intrinsic to God is identical to God. God doesn't have any parts. Divine timelessness says that God exists outside of time, so there's no succession in God's life. He isn't temporally located. He isn't temporally extended. There's no duration to his life. He doesn't experience one thing and then another. He doesn't do one thing and then another. So that's timelessness. Immutability is closely connected. This basically just means that God can't change. He's immutable. He's not mutable. And this is often articulated in terms of the act-potency distinction. So God has no potential to change or to intrinsically vary across worlds. So not only can't he change, but also he can't vary intrinsically across worlds. He's exactly intrinsically the same across all worlds. And they'll also say that he's purely actual. He doesn't have potential to change. So he's purely actual, etc. And then finally, impassibility. This is the fourth characteristic claim. And this is the one that we're going to be focused on today. It basically says that God can't be affected by anything or influenced by anything. God can't be moved by anything. God can't suffer. God can't experience passions, happenings to him. God's emotional life, as it were, that is his valenced conscious experience, is characterized by something like pure, undisturbable bliss or blessedness or happiness, something like that. And so he doesn't have, these negative emotions or anything like that, passions. He's not affected by anything, etc. So that's divine impassibility. It's a kind of collection of claims. And there are interesting relations between these four, whether or not some of them entail the others. But we don't need to get into that for present purposes. Now onwards, we march to your question, what matters here? What's at stake?
Mm-hmm.
One thing that matters, you might ask, why does it matter to me or anyone? Firstly, I think it's just intrinsically fascinating. We're talking about potentially the ultimate nature of reality, whether or not it's simple or complex, whether or not it's impassible or not impassible, that is, passable. So it's just intrinsically fascinating to think about these questions, both for theists and non-theists, because non-theists can think of it as, well, were God to exist, what would God be like? And also, if there are certain problems for both impassibility and passibility, non-theists might be equipped with new arguments against God's existence. If God were to exist, he'd either be impassible or passable, but there are certain problems for each, and so there's a problem for God's existence, right? So this is an interesting area of research for both theists and non-theists. For theists, it's how God is like. This is the fundamental nature of reality. For non-theists, this is also asking, well, were theism true, what would be the case? And you might even potentially garner arguments against God's existence on the basis of that, at least potentially. So that's one reason why it's intrinsically fascinating and why it matters. Again, we're just talking about the fundamental nature of reality. There's not much that's more important than that. For theists, we're talking about what God is like. That affects how we relate to him, how we think about God. It affects arguments for and against God's existence. Some arguments for and against God's existence rely on or entail or involve or presuppose a very particular conception of God, a very particular model of God. And if there are independent problems for that model of God, those are independent problems for those specific arguments for God's existence, right? So it's actually really relevant to arguments for God's existence and arguments against God's existence. Some of those presuppose a particular model of God. They might presuppose that God is emotionally responsive to the goings-on in creation, but under impassibility, that's not true. God is not emotionally responsive like that. So it's really relevant to arguments for and against God's existence. And that's something that I think philosophers of religion who don't work on models of God need to pay much more attention to. They'll oftentimes just implicitly assume a background model of God. But that background model of God can be contested, and there are ways to get around objections and arguments by just shifting your model of God. So it really does affect arguments for and against God's existence. So both theists and atheists should be interested in this. And I guess two final things. Firstly, it affects our broader conception of reality. So you might think that whether or not you think God is timeless or temporal will definitely affect whether or not we adopt a tensed or tenseless view of time. Many people have argued for that. So a lot of people have argued that if there's a tensed view of time, if there are these dynamically changing facts, well, then God's knowledge is going to have to change to track the facts, and God's going to have to be, in some manner, continually changing. And you might argue that that poses a challenge to immutability, or you might argue that that poses a challenge to timelessness. And so, contrary-wise, if you adopt timelessness, you might be pushed to a tenseless view of time. That is hugely significant, right? There's a debate about a philosophy of time and whether or not we should adopt a tensed or a tenseless view, whether presentism or eternalism is true, and the ontological status of different moments of time. So models of God may very well potentially affect our broader conception of reality, what the world is like. And of course, that intersects with different philosophical debates. And then the final thing that why this matters is that it affects different Christian denominations and their potential truth. So arguably, Catholicism is committed to at least certain aspects of classical theism. And so if there are independent challenges to things like impassibility, mutability, timelessness, simplicity, those are going to constitute independent challenges to Catholicism, for instance, and different brands of Christianity that require this kind of classical theism, or at least certain aspects of classical theism. So if you're a Christian, it definitely affects what denomination you should be in. And it affects which, and that affects your broader theological beliefs. It affects a ton of stuff. So this stuff really matters.
Wow. Thank you so much for that background on the way that your model of God can impact so many different areas. And, I really hadn't thought of all of the fine-grained different areas that it impacts. It's basically your conception of reality, how you argue for and against God, whether there's a problem with the model that you're using and presupposing in your arguments, and on, as you articulated well. Thank you for sharing that. Now, zooming in on impassibility, we get R.T. Mullins' paper, which he creates a problem for classical theism from impassibility, the rationality of God, and ultimately he derives the claim, and I noticed that you sort of finished the argument, that classical theism is false. So here we have a really important paper that Joe is interacting with from R.T. Mullins, and then Joe's paper points out a problem with that model or that argument, and then responds to it, provides a potential response, but that potential response actually leads to another argument, and Joe extends it. So for all the reasons Joe's articulated, it's a very important debate and paper. So I'm look forward to jumping into it. Why don't we start out with defining our terms, as philosophers do? And there are some important sort of reasons, constraints, and principles that are at play that R.T. Mullins articulates. And so it'd be good to get those on the table before we go into Mullins' argument. So first of all, what notion of reason is Mullins working with, and what is his understanding of a notion of acting for a reason? Because ultimately, the argument's going to involve whether God can act for a reason in creating the universe.
Yeah. Good. So I guess there's a general notion of reason that he's working under, and it's basically some consideration that counts in favor of an action, or that counts in favor of a choice, that somehow calls for that choice, or maybe justifies it, or recommends it, or counts in favor of it. There are these different locutions that we have in English to try to point out what we're getting at. But I think we're all kind of familiar with this. We have certain reasons for which we act, and one reason that counts in favor of having a chat with you here is that I can help people gain a better understanding of these issues and reality. And so it's a consideration that counts in favor of my having a conversation with you here. And so that's a general notion of reason. Now, he does break up the reasons that he's talking about into kind of intellectual motivating reasons and affective motivating reasons. So stepping back, there's the distinction between motivating and normative reasons. Normative reasons are, roughly speaking, reasons so they are considerations that count in favor of something, but they in some manner justify it, they in some manner recommend it, call for it, make it rational, something like that. And motivating reasons, on the other hand, they kind of push someone to act. They're like the explanation for why someone acted. Like if you kind of asked them to try to give an accounting of why they acted, the kind of reasons that pushed them or moved them to act would be the kind of motivating reasons. Sometimes these might be the exact same reasons here. The motivating reason might be the same as the normative reason. Sometimes they might come apart. You might have a motivating reason to do something that doesn't actually justify the action. You might, anyway, we'll probably get into that later. But that's a broader distinction between motivating and normative reasons. And then you can focus in on intellectual motivating reasons and affective motivating reasons, which Dr. Mullins focuses on. An intellectual motivational reason, or an intellectual motivating reason, involves an agent judging that the content of the end of their action, judging that the content of that end is good. So like, hey, if I did this action, that would be a good thing. And so doing that action is in some way desirable, or at least the consequence of that action is desirable. So it's a kind of intellectual judgment that the end is good, and so it's desirable. And so it's an intellectual motivating reason, it's a judgment. An affective motivating reason, by contrast, doesn't involve an intellectual judgment by the agent that the content is good, but instead it's an emotional response toward it. So maybe it's some sort of like positive valenced emotional response toward that content or something along those lines. But those are two. So we got the general notion, we got the distinction between motivating and normative reasons, which we'll probably get into later as well in more detail. And then the two kind of more specific motivating reasons that Mullins talks about, which are intellectual and affective reasons. But in general, I mean, I think we could probably, going forward, I think that we wouldn't lose much of substance by just focusing on, motivating and normative reasons more generally, instead of breaking it into intellectual and affective. But it is important to, probably just get those on the table, because that's how Dr. Mullins puts it in his paper. So.
Great. Yeah, we'll get into that later, but I do have some kind of questions about disambiguating the notion of reason. So not only in this talk are we going to go over Joe's excellent paper, but I thought we could also kind of playfully explore logical space. And one way we could do that, Joe mentioned, which is disambiguating normative from motivating reasons, to see if that can get any purchase in responding to or strengthening an objection Joe raises, and potentially seeing if there's any results from that. So yeah, we'll just flag that and we can move on from that for now. And then what is the notion of a reason's constraint on free choice that Mullins has in mind?
Yeah, so the reason's constraint, so again, there are certain key constraints and principles that are kind of the background of his argument. And once he has those in place, he kind of develops this problem of arbitrary creation for divine impassibility. So the reason's constraint on free choice, as at least Mullins articulates it, says that if, at a given time, an agent has neither any motivational intellectual reasons for performing some action, nor any motivational affective reasons for performing that action, then the agent is incapable at that time of freely choosing to do that action. So this is basically offering a necessary condition on an agent being able to freely choose to do an action at a given time. A necessary condition on that is that the agent either has a motivational intellectual reason for doing the thing in question, or a motivational affective reason for doing the thing in question. And I mean, the guiding idea here is if the agent lacks a reason altogether to perform some action, then they're not really they're not going to be able to be free in performing it. Free action is in some manner undergirded by reasons. That's the idea.
Yeah, and I guess I could flag just a little bit of a worry here about, because this constraint relies on this distinction between motivational and affective reasons. So as he mentioned, there's a judgment involved in the intellectual reason that the end is desirable. Now, there's a difference between judging that something is desirable, like I might judge that this kombucha is desirable, but I may have no desire to drink it. So when we look at whether a reason is the reason for which a person acts, there can be, if we don't somehow get into the notion of a reason that the agent was, and I know you can't say moved, because classical theists don't want to say God's moved by anything ad extra him. But I guess if it's an intrinsic reason that God has, then we need to know more. Just that God judged it desirable, but in some sense was God moved to act on the basis of that judgment that it was desirable. So was I moved to actually take a sip, which I'm going to do right now?
Yeah.
Was I actually moved? Is this the reason why I took a sip? Is because I judged that it would be a good thing to have delicious kombucha right now. So So, and then just one other thing I might flag, and this Mullins raises and sort of moves on from. The other thing is that, as he pointed out, there can be a motivational gap that gets introduced in the distinction between intellectual and affective reasons because, as he points out, affective reasons emotions can have intellectual components. And so he kind of moved on from that, and I'm just flagging that, but I just thought I'd throw those two things out, see if you wanted to play with that or move on. Or
No, I mean, I think those are good flags. And just one thing that I might try to say on behalf of Ryan is that, for the audience, I don't know if we already mentioned this, but Dr. Mullins, Ryan Mullins, this is the same person. It's Dr. Ryan Mullins or RT Mullins. These are all the same people, RT. Okay, that's just for the audience, because the audience may not be familiar with this sort of terrain. Okay, so yeah, just if I could say something on behalf of Ryan there, I'm thinking he could just take that flag and be like, that's a good point. We should just keep in mind that he was only offering a necessary condition on free choice. So like, it's just at least a necessary condition. It may not be sufficient, but it's at least a necessary condition that the agent either judges the end to be desirable or good, or at least has some, emotional directedness, affective response to it, or something along those lines. So one of those options is just a necessary condition on acting freely at a given time. And if there's a further necessary condition that needs to be met, okay, maybe I actually need to desire it and then have an appropriate connection between that desire and my action. Maybe that's also necessary, as you were kind of hinting at. But minimally, his conditions are necessary. I think that's probably what he would say. But those are good flags. I just wanted to say that.
Okay, that's a helpful clarification. Yeah, thank you. And then we get into the creation principle and then the no unfulfilled desires constraint. We can kind of go through these quickly, but these are also important parts of his argument.
Yeah. So at least the classical theist at whom he is taking aim in his article, that sort of classical theist affirms the creation principle, which says that God is free to create or not create the universe. So God has leeway freedom concerning whether or not he creates. So, it's not as though God's perfection is diminished if he existed without creation or anything like that. God is perfectly self-sufficient in himself. So, God's both free to create and to refrain from creating. So God really could have existed alone, or God could have existed with a universe, as evidently is the case if you're a theist. So that's the creation principle. I just want to flag that, not absolutely every single classical theist who accepts those four core doctrines that we talked about earlier, the four core distinctive attributes of classical theism, not every single classical theist affirms this, but at least the classical theists at which he's taking aim, like those broadly following Augustine, Aquinas, Lombard, Boethius, Anselm, and contemporary thinkers, etc. They're going to be affirming this. Okay. So that's the creation principle. And then the no unfulfilled desires constraint is basically saying that under classical theism, God can't have any unfulfilled desires that are satisfied by creation. So the non-classical theist, according to Mullins, will generally deny this no unfulfilled desires constraint, but the classical theist, according to Mullins, is going to affirm it. And I mean, part of the idea is that God's just perfectly fulfilled and perfectly happy in himself. So it's not as though he could have any needs or desires that only creation could have satisfied. So that's kind of the guiding idea behind this principle, according to Mullins.
Okay, yeah, and this sort of gets back into a little bit of the flag that I raised, just because the thing that would shore up the difference between judging that an end's desirable and actually on the basis of that judgment being moved to do what you do is that you have a desire. I believe that a particular thing would be good, or judge that a particular end would be good. And then on that basis, I also desire that end. And that's what moves me. And then you have this nice package, which is a belief-desire pair, as it's often called. And that can readily explain why the agent did what she did. My worry was if you don't have the desire in there, you can say that, yeah, you had this intellectual motivating reason or emotional reason, but it really wasn't the reason for which you acted. So this gets into like, if the classical theist can't allow for desire, God having a desire, because that would be God moving from one state to another state, namely a state of being unfulfilled or not having a satisfied desire to having a satisfied desire, that would be intrinsic change, and that's debarred from classical theism, then why not go the simpler route, and just say, this is the correct notion of reasons. You need this connection with desire in order to have a motivational reason. Classical theism can't account for that. That's a problem. Now, obviously, that's pretty simplistic, and you would have to bake in and really argue for that notion of a reason, which is kind of standard in the literature on reasons, although there's problems with it. But what do you think about that? Is that a good route to go, or is there
like a more direct route against classical theism? Basically, it's a good question. I have a few thoughts on that. So, one thought is, so there are kind of two claims here. One of them is that in order to have a reason for action, which, I mean, again, the classical theist, we're about to get to this, but the classical theist wants to say that God has reasons for acting as he does. That's part of God's perfect rationality. So we have two claims here. One is, in order to have a reason, you basically need to have a desire. And then the second one is that, well, classical theism can't really account for that. It like kind of debars that element of having a reason. So there are kind of two claims there. And so given that, they could kind of attack either one of those claims. One of them is to say, well, no, actually having a reason or acting for reasons does not require having desire or something like that. Okay, fine, this may be plausible in the case of humans, and they're going to say, like, but God is not human. God is very radically different from us, right? What should we expect? This is being itself. This is the ipsum esse subsistens, whatever that means. this is this fundamental, ultimate, transcendent, absolutely simple being. The motivational structure of this being, or lack thereof, the way by which this being creates and acts is plausibly going to be beyond us in some way, and so then we shouldn't be foisting on the classical theist this kind of very, shall we say, anthropomorphic conception of reasons. That's probably one thing that they're going to say. Now, in response to that, you might say, I mean, this isn't anthropomorphic. It's just like practically unintelligible to understand how someone could have a reason for acting without like desiring to bring the end about. So there are, you could go back and forth here, but that's one way that the classical theist could respond. They could just deny that element of reason. They could say, okay, that's plausible in the case of humans, but not in the case of God. And we have to develop, we have to be very careful about talking about God. That's one thing they could say. A second thing they could say, which is challenging that second claim there, which is that classical theism can't account for God having reasons. They might just reject Mullins' claim that classical theists either aren't allowed to say that God has desires, or at least aren't allowed to say that God has desires that are satisfied by creation. They might just be able to say, no, God can have desires, and he can have desires for creation, and that creation in some manner satisfies. And it's not as though that would entail some intrinsic change in God. God fully from eternity has those desires. He has them intrinsically, and whether or not they're satisfied is just a matter of whether or not that intrinsic state of God is accurately relating to the world, and whether or not the world's end of the bargain satisfies that desire. So they might say this is a purely extrinsic matter, whether or not God's desires are satisfied. And so it's not as though when creation comes into being, it's not as though God has himself changed in some way. They might say it's an extrinsic change, and that's not problematic, at least according to them. And then they might say, yeah, it's perfectly fine for God to have that sort of desire. And then you can go back and forth on that, whether or not the classical theist can really say that. But I think that suffices for my response.
Yeah, thank you for that. Those are two viable routes to go. And what it brings to mind is perhaps, just a perhaps, in the future, it looks like a lot of the action is going to be right there. That is, can God have a desire? Is having a desire crucial or constitutive of having a motivational reason? And it seems like, at least in the future, that'll be an important topic to consider and go back and forth, perhaps in the way you suggested, to go back and forth between the classical theist about that.
That's good, yeah.
Awesome. Well, All right, let's jump into with those terms on the table and constraints and principle. Can you walk us through Mullins' problem of arbitrary creation? So, just letting the cat out of the bag, it's kind of looks like God has no reason for creating the universe if Mullins' argument succeeds. And obviously, the classical theist doesn't want that, as Joe mentioned. So, yeah, if you could walk us through that, that'd be great. And then also, I have the premises, the argument I can throw up on the screen too. So let's do that.
Okay, sweet. Yeah. So at least broad brushstrokes before we get to the formalized argument itself. You can keep it on there. That's totally fine. But broad brushstrokes. Mullins is arguing that there's a problem for divine impassibility. So recall divine impassibility that I mentioned earlier on in the video. It's basically saying God can't be affected by anything, moved by anything, influenced by anything. God's emotional life, as it were, is one of pure, undisturbable bliss or blessedness or happiness, and God can't suffer or be, he doesn't have passions. He's not like affected by those sorts of things. Okay, so that's the general claim of impassibility. And what Ryan wants to argue is that if God is impassible, well then he did not create the universe for a reason, but that's absurd. And hence, impassibility is false. And that's the basic idea. And why is it absurd to think God didn't create the universe for a reason? Well, because, listen, God's supposed to be perfectly rational. This is just a core aspect of all the models of God, that God is perfectly rational. And a perfectly rational being always acts for a reason. They have a reason undergirding their actions. And so if there's no reason for God to create the universe, if he doesn't have a reason, then he's not perfectly rational. But God is perfectly rational. And so since divine impassibility entails that God did not create the universe for a reason, but God really did create the universe for a reason because he's perfectly rational, it follows that God is not impassible. And so that's a problem for the classical theist. So yeah, the premise by premise formulation of this is, the first premise is an assumption for reductio. It's that God is impassible. And then we get two further premises, that God is perfectly rational and that God created the universe. The fourth premise is that if God is perfectly rational, well, then God created the universe for a reason. The idea behind that, again, is that a perfectly rational being always acts on the basis for a reason. And so since God really did create the universe, then if he's perfectly rational, then he created it for a reason. And so from those, it follows that God created the universe for a reason. But then the crucial premise, premise 6, if God is impassible, then God created the universe for no reason. And so, of course, since we assumed for reductio that God is impassible, it follows that God created the universe for no reason. But we just got a contradiction, right? We concluded that God created the universe for a reason because he's perfectly rational, but also he didn't create the universe for a reason because he's impassible. And so we've got a kind of contradiction here. And the idea is that because we got a contradiction, we have to reject that assumption for reductio, that God is impassible. And so it follows that God is not impassible. And from that, we basically conclude that classical theism is false because classical theism includes the claim that God is impassible. That's Ryan's argument, in short. And again, the central premise there is that if God is impassible, it's that sixth premise. If God is impassible, then God created the universe for no reason. That is that key premise. And the basic idea is that, given that God's impassible, right, God's reasons for freely acting can't be, due to anything ad extra to the divine nature, since, nothing outside the impassible God can, move or influence him in any way, right? And so if God can't be influenced by considerations of things add extra to him, then there's nothing about creation that kind of tells in favor of creating it, and only things that could, in some manner move God to act are intrinsic to God, and that's only going to be necessary stuff about the divine nature. That's going to have nothing to do, so the thought goes, with creation itself. So the basic idea is that if God is going to create for a reason, then it's going to have to be the case that something add extra to the divine nature, like the possible value of creatures, or maybe creatures themselves, or something like that, are going to have to be influencing God in some way. But that's not allowed under divine impassibility. So that's the basic thrust. I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
No, that was an excellent explanation, and it does seem like the controversial premise is 6, as you mentioned. So I guess the classical theist would have to argue that God is impassible, but it's possible that God created the universe for a reason. So they'd have to deny 6. So the classical theist has to come up with some sort of way that God could have reason-based action to create the universe, even though he can't be moved by anything, as Joe said, ad extra or anything extrinsic to him. But the universe is, I mean, you would think like what he could create should in some sense inform or I don't want to say motivate, but it should in some sense be the reason for which he acts. And it's weird to say that essentially what ends up happening, which you mentioned, is that it looks like God like arbitrarily created the universe.
Yeah, that's where the name comes from. Good.
Yeah.
It's the problem of arbitrary creation because it's arbitrary in the sense that there's no reason undergirding his act of creating the universe. So that's where it's good that you made that connection. That's why it's called the problem of arbitrary creation, because it's basically saying, like, if classical theism is true, so the thought goes, so the argument goes, God has no reason for creating the universe, so it's arbitrary creation.
Great. And now you bring in an interesting distinction between doing something on the basis of something itself or doing something on consideration of that thing. So could you mention that distinction, and then how does that play into your response to Mullins? And then how do you create that story that sort of strengthens that objection from the distinction? And then how does that tee up your extended problem of arbitrary creation?
Good, yeah. So there is this distinction between an agent doing something on the basis of a consideration of something else versus that agent doing the thing on the basis of that something else, okay? That was a bit complicated, but let me give you an example because the example will help it make sense. Suppose that I'm thinking about having a child. Well, let's not do having a child. Let's think about how about I'm considering adopting.
I'm a father to two little boys, 2 and 3. Don't use that example. I'm doing this right now to get a break from them.
Yeah, exactly.
Sorry.
Yeah, exactly. So let's say I am considering making a pet rock. Okay, so a pet rock. I think I had one of those at one point. It had like googly eyes. I think I gave it a name.
Oh, nice.
I think I put it on a leash and dragged it down. I was very young. But yeah. Okay. So I'm thinking about making a pet rock. So I have a reason to make this pet rock, and presumably that's going to involve, like, part of the reason why I'm thinking about making this pet rock, and let's suppose I go on to make it. Part of the basis for my making this pet rock is my considering of what this rock would be like. My envisaging, I'm imagining in my mind what it would be like. I'm considering what having this rock would be and all the great pleasure that it would bring me and my family and the world at large. So here, I'm at least partly making a pet rock on the basis of a consideration of the rock, like imagining it, considering it in my mind, thinking about it, etc. That's different from like making the pet rock on the basis of the rock itself. Like somehow the rock itself entered into my reason for like creating the rock. But like that's kind of implausible in this case. Like the rock doesn't even exist until I make it, right? So it's not as though like the rock itself is somehow influencing me, or it's not as though like my action is itself explained by the rock itself. No, my action is based on considering the rock. It's based on a consideration of what the rock would be like, or the future rock. So that's the basis, or at least, that's the basis for which I'm acting here. That's the reason, that's the explanation of my action here. It's not the rock itself, because the rock doesn't even exist. It's my consideration, my imaginations, my envisagings of the rock, okay? So you can distinguish between doing something on the basis of a consideration of X versus doing something on the basis of X itself, like that extramental thing. Now, once we have this distinction in hand, we can see a problem for Ryan's argument from arbitrary creation. Okay, sure. So I've got my classical theist hat on. Okay, sure, says the classical theist. God can't do something on the basis of, like, something external to him, right? He can't do something on the basis of creation itself. Like, creation itself cannot enter into the explanation or the grounding or the basis or whatever of why God chose as he did or acted as he did. That would involve something outside of him influencing him in some way, or informing him in some way, or him being responsive to something ad extra in some way that's problematic by the lights of divine impassibility. Okay, fine, they can grant Mullins that. But like, they don't need to say that in order to say, that God creates on the basis of a reason for creating. Because they can say that God creates on the basis of a consideration of creatures, or a consideration of the values of creatures, some envisaging, something within God, right? Some consideration of God's, his knowledge of the possible creatures, of their possible values and those things, which is internal to God. This is not something outside of God, influencing God, but rather this is something inside of God. And that's the basis for his creating of those creatures. It's on the basis of his consideration of those creatures, not on the basis of those creatures themselves, because those would be external to God, and those influencing God would indeed be problematic by the lights of the impassible West. But that's not what they're saying, and it's not what they need to say. They can get around the argument by saying, no, we don't need to say that. We could just say that God creates on the basis of consideration of creatures, and that consideration is internal to God, and so it's not something external to God that problematically influences him. So that's the basic idea, and you can see how that challenges Ryan's argument, right? Ryan's argument is saying, well, like, in order for God to have a reason to create, something outside of him would have to kind of influence him in some way, or he'd somehow have to be responsive to it in some way. But the response is, no, that's not the case. In order for God to create for a reason, it doesn't have to be the case. There's something ad extra that influences him, or motivates him, or moves him, or is the basis for which he acts. Instead, it could be something internal to God, and that's God's consideration of creatures, and his knowledge of them, his envisaging them, his perfect awareness of what possible creatures and values that there are. And again, that God's knowledge there, that awareness, that consideration is wholly internal to God. So it's not as though there's something outside of God influencing or affecting him or moving him. And so the thought goes, they can preserve impassibility while also saying that God creates on the basis, creates for reasons. So yeah, that's the basic idea.
Okay. Yeah, I like that distinction. I guess I have a question about it. So it's pretty clear, like you have on the one hand consideration of possibilities of things that aren't yet actual. And so it'd be weird to say that you did something on the basis of something itself when you were merely imagining it as possible. I guess a question I have is that when we're talking about, this gets into a lot of mental states. So you mentioned imagination, you mentioned knowledge, you mentioned awareness.
Yeah.
I don't know that much hangs on that. I don't want to put a lot of stock into that, but you're going to have some sort of mental content, or God will have some sort of contents. Now, that mental content, although there's nothing in actuality that it's currently referring to, I'm just wondering if there's a special case with God, because God can, just on the basis of sort of imagining and speaking, bring things into existence. So even though at the time that, let's say, God is considering possible creatures and possible values, he's not doing his action, creating the universe on the basis of those things itself. But there is a sense in which those things, especially because God, if God wants to actualize creatures and values, it's going to happen, that in some sense the mental contents of God's imaginings or knowledge is going to be partly constituted by those things. And so the worry, or just the question, would be in what sense is God not being moved by something ad extra to God, even though you could say, well, it's all internal. But the mental contents itself are referring not back to God's imagination. They're referring to something that could potentially exist. And in fact, if God wants it to exist, it will exist. I don't know. Yeah, if you want to riff off that, or if you think that's there's a worry there or not, or
good. That's good. Okay. So I think what the classical theist is going to say is that the mental content isn't like problematically external to God here or anything like that. These are the kind of, they're probably going to wed this to a kind of divine conceptualism of some sort. So these are basically the exemplars, or the exemplary forms of things within God's mind. It's kind of like the Platonic forms that they lasso up from Plato's heaven and stick it into God's mind. That's basically what they're doing. And so they're going to probably point to that. Like, that's the content. It's these possible forms or essences or universals that creatures could instantiate the various different creatures and the different ensembles of creatures. You might even think that there are like propositions here in God's mind that are thoughts, and he might have collections of them that represent worlds. And so, yeah, the contents needn't be somehow external to God or referring to something in the sense of like really accurately latching on to something referentially that's out there. No, they're all totally wholly internal to God, because these are just like his divine concepts and their divine thoughts. And yeah, so I guess that's probably what they're going to say. Like, no, these aren't like referential things. It's not kind of like how language refers to objects in the world, but more so how it's more so on the analogy of how like a builder thinks about and constructs a blueprint in their mind before they go on and build the thing itself. The blueprint is entirely in their mind. It's not like, it's not referring to anything outside of him. I mean, in some sense, or he or she, in some sense, it's representing what will come to be, but that representation doesn't require there to be that external thing, I don't think, and it doesn't require that external thing to somehow influence the builder, because it's not even there yet. It hasn't even been built yet, so it can't like influence the builder. So the thought goes. Now, okay. So I think that's how they're going to try to respond to that. Now, there is a lurking worry, but this might get into the the extension that I talk about later. Like, I mean, listen, if it's so hard to think about, because if we have these kind of exemplary forms in God's mind, and then those are in some way moving God or influencing God, or God's doing something on the basis of them, we have a kind of hierarchy of dependence here. We have God's acting on the basis of something which isn't God's acting. It's like the consideration of these forms, like the contents are there, and then the contents have a kind of explanatory relation to the action that God performs. And so we still seem to we're kind of dividing God up in a way that doesn't seem to be allowed for under divine simplicity, it still seems. So that's one worry you might have. And also another worry is like, it's really hard to make sense of this kind of moving God locution. Like, how is God, like, does God create on the basis of something? If he's creating on the basis of something, it seems as though something is like influencing him in some way or moving him in some way. Even if that thing is internal to him, it's still a problem if it's moving or influencing God. Because God can't be moved even by something internal to him. Then he'd be in some manner actualized by something, or some part of him would be actualized by another part. So he'd be a mixture of act and potency, or, yeah. So, I mean, he still can't be influenced by something ad extra, but he also can't be influenced by something ad intra. Because again, that introduces one element of him, as it were, exerting some influence on another element of him. So you still have like some sort of actualization of potential or something like that in God, and that's debarred by divine simplicity. So you might think that there are these two lingering problems. I'd probably have to think about them further to form an ultimate view on them, but they're at least prima facie worries.
Yeah, those seem like legitimate worries that are lurking in the background. Yeah, thank you for. It does seem like if you have these, I don't want to say Platonic form, but there are Christian Platonists. But it does seem like if you have this blueprint or this model of what something should be, even if it's just the form of a creature with a particular set of values in a particular creation, it's hard to see how that isn't in any way delineated in God's mind in a way that makes it distinct. Mm-hmm. It is internal to God, but how is it not? It seems like there's
intrinsic to him.
It's intrinsic to him, but the worry that you're articulating is that there's a dependence, on even those forms or the exemplars or the ideal sort of instantiations in God's mind, and if God's creating on the basis of those considerations, how is that not a distinction in God?
Yeah, and some sort of like dependence relation in him. And again, we're not saying that like God is depending on his ideas. Instead, we're saying that God's act of creation, like the act by which God brought about creation, seems to be in some manner responsive to some explanatorily prior, more fundamental layer of God. And that layer is like the forms on the basis of which he is creating, right? If he's truly creating on the basis of something, on the basis of a reason that's motivating him in some manner, then yeah, it seems as though there's going to have to be some sort of prior reality in God upon which God's act of creation depends. And that's just debarred by classical theism. You can't divide up God in this sort of way and have dependence relations among positive ontological items that are intrinsic to God and distinct from God. So that's, I guess, I mean, now we're kind of getting into the extension of...
yeah, I was going to say, if you want to go into that, there's a natural segue there.
Yeah. So that's a good segue. The basic idea, and I saw in your notes, and that was a good question, whether or not this is an extension or a replacement. I didn't really consider that. I just thought it was something that's kind of related and, strengthens the case. So whether it's an extension or replacement, we can use words. I don't really mind. So yeah, whether it's an extension or replacement, let's just call it an extension. The basic idea here is that, like, God's act of creation is an intentional action, right? He's not like accidentally creating the universe. He's intentionally doing it, even if only analogously so. And no one's saying that, like, his intentions he has intentions in exactly the same sense that humans have intentions. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that there's, at least some literal sense, even if only analogously so, that God's act of creation is intentional. But, like, I can't make sense of an intentional action that isn't, done on the basis of some reason, whether normative or motivating. What it is to be an intentional action is just partly to be undergirded by some reason for acting. So that's the next step in this. But, like, if you perform an intentional action on the basis of some sort of reason, well, then it seems as though that reason, it seems as though the intentional action is in some manner dependent on that prior reason. And by prior, I mean, like, metaphysically prior.
And I do have this, if that'd be helpful. Bam, I got it for you.
Oh, good. Yeah. So yeah, the basic idea is that God's act of creation is an intentional action, but because intentional actions are done on the basis of reasons, it seems as though the intentional action would in some manner have to be done on the basis of, or responsive to, or in some manner, I don't want to say generated by, but, like, explained by, dependent upon one or more reasons. And if that's the case, well then, well, firstly, God's not going to be able to be identical to his act of creation, his intentional act, because his intentional act of creation is dependent on something, namely reasons, but God isn't dependent on anything. And so God has some property that God's act of creation doesn't, or God satisfies some predicate that God's act of creation doesn't, and so they have to be distinct, which violates divine simplicity. Yeah, that premise is relevant. So there's that problem, but also, this just creates a division in God between God's act of creation and then, the kind of mental states that undergirded or justified or in some manner explained that action, which served as reasons, either motivating or normative, for that action. So that's the basic idea behind the argument. You can run it in different ways, but the basic idea is that because God's act of creation is an intentional action, and because intentional actions are done on the basis of reasons, it would seem to be the case that God's action is in some manner dependent on reasons. But, nothing in God could be, it's not as though God's action could be dependent, because that introduces dependence relations among things intrinsic to God that are distinct from God. And also, again, because the intentional action is dependent and God's not dependent, it's going to follow that that intentional action is distinct from God, or so it seems. Whereas on divine simplicity, God is identical to each of his actions. So that's the basic idea. I think I say in the article, like, I'm doing this to try to help classical theists develop models of reason-based action that are consistent with classical theism and that avoid, that avoid this kind of dependence on prior reasons. So, like, I don't pretend that this is like a knockdown argument. There are very few knockdown arguments in philosophy. I know of very, very few of those. So no one is pretending that this is knocked down. So, like, I'm not saying that the classical theists can't get out of this. I'm really just trying to help them. Can you guys develop a model of reason-based action that doesn't introduce dependence, that doesn't make God's act dependent on reasons? And so, yeah, I'm trying to help them. Right now, I don't see one, but, there may very well be one, and there may be some on offer that I'm just not aware of. I have to have that requisite intellectual and epistemic humility. So it seems to be a problem to my lights, but, it's always a prima facie problem because, they could develop a model which avoids the problem. So that's the idea.
Great. Yeah, and I love that about your work. In a lot of your work, you just mentioned that really is the motivation. You want to spur on the literature and the classical theist to further refine their view and sort of address these worries you're raising. So
I want to help them. I'm making this argument, but like I want to help. I'm trying to help you guys develop your view. I'm trying to help you.
Right.
I want to see how they could understand intentional actions that aren't dependent on reasons. Like for me, it's really hard to make sense of that. But, but so I'm trying to help them, and if they can, show a way to be able to do that doesn't introduce dependence, then I'll be like, okay, that's interesting, and I will see that as dialectical progress. So this argument is a tool; it's not a weapon to bash classical theists with. And does it succeed? I don't know. Time will tell. So, again, I want to say I find it plausible. I'm not. I defended this argument in the paper, right? I defended it against objections, but so I find it plausible. But I'm totally open to revision, just because classical theists can develop models. So. Again, try to help them.
Right. And so in that spirit, I tried to kind of brainstorm a few options for the classical theist to perhaps start heading in that direction. If I
could just interject briefly.
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, I was trying to subtly anticipate some of your objections in my articulation there.
Nice.
I was basically saying, like, intentional actions are seemingly dependent on one or more reasons, even if they're motivational or normative. So, like, pick your poison, basically. So it's like, because they still seem to be dependent on them. So anyway, I was trying to anticipate one way that I was going to respond to your points, but you did bring up really good points, so I'll turn it back over to you.
Oh, yeah. So let me go ahead and put on my thinking cap, my
nice
Stranger Things thinking cap there. Try to help out the classical theist right here. Get that thinking cap on. Okay, so I tried to pick up on your story. You introduced a story that would strengthen your response, which is that God ultimately, and correct me if I'm getting this wrong, God can bring about creation on consideration of his divine essence, because he has, and it's on the basis of his perfect knowledge that he would know all the things that are entailed by the powers he has.
Yeah.
So he would know that there are certain creatures that could be created and placed in certain creations, and that would instantiate certain values like love, beauty, aesthetic values, moral values. And so it looks like there are these values that God considers, and the values are extrinsic to God. They're ad extra to God because they're contingent, and God is not contingent, and the values haven't been brought about. So God can consider those things that are extrinsic, or in some sense ad extra God, but ultimately he's going to act on the basis of that consideration, which is constituted by his perfect knowledge of his essence, his divine essence, and his powers, and that which it entails.
Exactly.
And I hope I did that justice.
That was perfect, yes.
Okay. So yeah, that's an interesting thing that sort of strengthens Joe's, or adds a little bit of teeth to Joe's worry. And then I was playing with the distinction. We've been sort of hinting at it, but there's you can disambiguate reasons between normative reasons and motivating reasons. Normative reasons, one way of cashing them out is that they're facts about certain things that would justify an action. So I was thinking, could the classical theist say that the values, there's facts about what sort of values could be instantiated by possible creatures and possible creations, and those are the normative reasons that would justify God acting, but those normative reasons are dependent on God. God isn't dependent on them. So you can think of this as like a supervenience relation. Like there can't be a change in the reasons unless there's a change in God, but God can change without a change in the reasons. So there's a an asymmetry there. And so God's not dependent on those normative reasons. But yet, when it comes to God's knowledge that you articulated being the consideration on which God creates, that could be constituted by the motivational reasons, perhaps intellectual, going back to Ryan's distinction, intellectual reasons or emotional or affective reasons. And those you could say God depends on, but it's okay because it's like God depending on himself. And given God's aseity, he's self-sufficient, self-existent. So even though it looks, God, why did you create the universe? Well, I considered my knowledge, and I imagined all the possible creatures, and I imagined all the possible values. And even though I considered those things, why I really did it was in order to, I don't know what they would want to say. Oftentimes, classical theists a lot hinge on God's glory or something. Like,
Yeah.
I wanted to, it's true, I didn't have to create, could have been fine just in my pure bliss, but I wanted to extend my glory or my perfect state, my happiness into a broader swath of existence. And it's on the basis of that knowledge and perhaps God's love and God's justice or God's compassion, something like that, that's intrinsic to God. That's the basis on which God created. And there's no distinction there because that's all God. And so God's act is equal to God, is equal to his motivating reasons, is equal to his knowledge, and it's all internal to God. And sure, there are these normative facts that justify God, but ultimately what he did, it was on the basis of the motivational reason. So that was kind of a rough pass at maybe a way. I don't know that it works, but it seems like you already have a response to it, which is great.
That's good. I mean, I think that's a really valuable response. And, as you know, I consider something similar in the paper. And I guess, my response right now is just, what I'm thinking is, I can't make sense of self-dependence. I think of dependence as irreflexive. If X depends on Y, then X cannot be Y. Because an X is in some way receiving something from Y. It's like there's an asymmetry there. There's a kind of directionality there. There's a from one thing to another. There's a from one thing to anotherness to it, as it were. So like I depend on my parents. I can't be identical to my parents precisely in part because I depend on them. So I can't really make sense of self-dependence. And if that's the case, and if something can't be dependent on itself in any way, then so long as we have a dependence relation between God's action and the reason, either the motivating reason or the normative reason or what have you, then it's just going to follow that there's a kind of distinction there. And once we have that distinction, I think that's where the problem arises, because then there are distinct things intrinsic to God, which is debarred by divine simplicity. Remember, everything intrinsic to God is distinct from God under divine simplicity. So I guess that's my thought. So, you're trying to, at least I thought you were trying to go along the lines of something like self-dependence, and it's really hard for me. I'm sorry, I can't make sense of that. It's difficult.
Yeah. So I guess the thought would be that God is, you're right, in everything else, if it's going to depend upon something, then there's going to be a distinction there, and there'll be a relation of dependence that's not just equal to the thing itself. But I guess the classical theist would want to say God is a special case, and his dependence relation can be reflexive in a way that's, he's the one unique, on this model, he's the one unique creator and sustainer of everything. And so it's not problematic for God to depend on God in that way, in the same way that it would be problematic and for us to say, like, I depend on my wife for this, but I'm equal to my wife. That'd be absurd. But to say that God depends on God to create doesn't seem as absurd, especially given his aseity.
See,
That'd be the thought.
I think that makes
I don't
it
know.
worse. Like, as I think of aseity,
You think it makes it worse?
Yeah, aseity is like independence. God isn't dependent on anything. So it's like, God can't be dependent then on God, because if he's ase, he doesn't depend on anything. He doesn't. Yeah, I mean, that's how I kind of conceive of aseity. Someone might think of aseity as self-dependence and not depending on anything else. Maybe that's how they might articulate it. But
yeah, I've heard it articulated as self-dependence, self-sufficiency. Maybe
yeah,
that's getting closer.
Differently, because a lot of people
Maybe that.
Well, yeah, no, that's good. I mean, there might come down here to a clash of intuitions. I'm not sure, but for me, it's just so hard to shake that intuition that dependence is irreflexive. I mean, if X depends on Y, then X is receiving in some manner either some characteristic or its existence from Y. And so then Y has to be prior to X, maybe not temporally prior, but at least metaphysically prior, so as to be the thing from which X could receive either its existence or aspects of its character or some way that it is, right? So Y would have to, in some manner, be prior to X. But if Y is prior to X, nothing could be prior to itself. So, because then it'd be both prior to itself and posterior to itself, which I think is absurd. So I see dependence as a kind of priority relation wherein one thing receives either its existence or the way that it is, its character, from another. And to me, that introduces a kind of distinction. I don't claim that everyone has to be beholden to my intuitions there, but it's just, let's just say that's at least, if the classical theist has to do that to get around this argument, I would personally take that as a very high cost, and at least by my lights, there would be a very high price tag in accepting classical theism. But again, I don't claim that classical theists have to be beholden to my intuition. So if they don't share that, okay, I guess I could just say fair enough. One final thing that I want to say on that is, like, you might think that if there is a dependence relation there, then there's some kind of actualization. You might think that if X depends on Y, then Y in some manner actualizes X. It either actualizes the existence of X or actualizes, in some manner brings about, or in some manner generates, or accounts for, or actualizes X's existence, or some aspect of X, or the character of X, or the way that X is. And if we understand dependence in that way, as a kind of actualization, well then God won't be able to be dependent on anything, because God's like purely actual. He's the unactualized actualizer. He can't be actualized by anything. That would amount to him, being like, even if it's himself, he still can't be actualized. Like, that would amount to him having some potential that is actualized, that is brought about by something. And God's purely actually, he doesn't have any unactualized. He can't be actualized. He's already perfectly, fully, wholly actual. That's part of how they conceive of God's perfection. So he's not like perfected or actualized by something, even if that's himself. So that's another way that you might go about arguing for that. But yeah, I guess that's what I'd say on this. And again, it's fine if we get down, if me and the classical theist, if we get down to a clash of intuitions. I guess that's oftentimes that happens in philosophy.
But I do think you made a good point, articulating the various ways you might respond, but also even if it is a clash of intuitions and you get the classical theist to bite a bullet, like where I was trying to go, or if you think that's bullet biting,
I think it's a big bullet,
you're right. And then what you said comes into play. You've raised the theoretical cost of embracing classical theism because you have to do this awkward move. I think I think it does come down to self-sufficiency and reflexivity, reflexive relation. So I think they would need to do more work on self-sufficiency and a reflexive relation regarding dependence.
Yeah.
So that they could do the work, and it may be less awkward once they work out the details. But again, now you're pushing them, so you're doing your job.
Yeah, that goes back to our point. This is meant to help them. Yeah,
that is a great place to end. And thank you for all you have done for the classical theist and just all your research. And I'm just really impressed and encouraged by what you're doing and the next phase. Grad school considerations and stuff. I wish the best for you, Joe. I look forward to dialoguing with you in the future as well, and following you and investigating your research. And I hope today has been helpful for not only the classical theist, but also the non-classical theist. And I hope we pushed on the edges and then also just laid out Joe's excellent paper, which again, I definitely recommend you go read the whole thing. It definitely is worth it, and I'll provide a link to it as well. And again, go check out Joe's channel, Majesty of Reason. And thanks for joining me on Faith and Rationality Shop Talk, Joe, and we'll see you in the future.
Awesome. Thanks for having me, and I really enjoyed this.